So, looking for the stragglers to come on in so we can get going here. Yeah. So, well, welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed our lunch, and a huge thank you to those who put lunch together for us. Yeah. And let us begin our afternoon session with some more singing.
I hope you all have didn't mean to use my opera voice on you, a green sheet. If you'd like to stand, you can sit if you want. It's totally up to you. You're going to be sitting here for a while, though, just FYI. So it might be a good thing for you to stand up and just sing praise to the Lord. Would you stand? Love divine, all loves excelling, joy of heaven to earth come down. Fix in us thy humble dwelling, all thy faithful mercies crown. Jesus, thou art all compassion, pure unbounded love thou art. Visit us with thy salvation, enter every trembling heart. Finish then thy new creation, pure and spotless let us be. Let us see thy great salvation, perfectly restored in thee. Change from glory unto glory, till in heaven we take our place, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love, and praise. Majesty, worship his majesty. Unto Jesus be all glory, honor, and praise. Majesty, kingdom, authority, flow from his throne unto his own, his anthem raise. So exalt, lift up on high the name of Jesus. Magnify, come glorify, praise Jesus the King. Majesty, worship his majesty. Jesus who died, now glorified, King of all kings. Don't forget to turn the page over. Give thanks to the Lord for his great love for us. Give thanks with a grateful heart. Give thanks to the Holy One. Give thanks because he's given Jesus Christ, his Son. And now let the weak say, I am strong. Let the poor say, I am rich, because of what the Lord has done for us. And now let the weak say, I am strong. Let the poor say, I am rich. the dreadful curse for my soul, for my soul. To bear the dreadful curse for my soul. To God and to the Lamb I will sing, I will sing. To God and to the Lamb I will sing. Oh, to God and to the Lamb, who is the great I am. While millions join the theme, I will sing, I will sing. While millions join the theme, I will sing. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing and joyful be. And through eternity, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And through eternity, I'll sing on. Amen.
We could do that. Is everybody else feeling a little stuffy? We can open some windows. We can do that. So we are going to open some windows and also invite Dr. Root to come back up, and looking forward to hearing what he has to say this afternoon. So, Jerry?
Thank you.
You don't need this.
This on? There you go. Now comes the hard part. It's one thing to talk about the love of God. It's another thing then to enter into the awareness of his love and look at our stuff. And we've all got stuff. And so consequently, some of those illustrations, maybe I looked okay in them. I won't look so okay in some of these illustrations. So let's pray. Lord, we do have stuff, and it breaks our heart. And sometimes we're caught in the vortex of it, and we don't know how to get out. Sometimes we see what the consequences of our stuff unattended to, the collateral damage it's causing others. We want to get better. I pray that you would give each person here the liberty to let down their guard before you. And you would give each person the liberty to hear those very things, that truth that Jesus says, know the truth and the truth shall set you free. And I pray, Father, that in the place of our brokenness, we would find that you have not failed us, but instead you are mending us, preparing us, and seeking to deploy us, that we might be your ambassadors in a broken world. Cultivate in us self-awareness, I ask. And again, I pray that you would fill us with your Spirit, and that your Spirit would take these fumbling words of mine and transport them to each heart here, so that every person here would hear what he or she needs to hear from you. Work that miracle among us, I pray, for Christ's sake. Amen. The developmental theorists, people like Piaget, Piaget working with cognitive development, Erik Erikson in psychosocial development, Kohlberg and Gilligan in moral development, Fowler and Perry in spiritual development, and so on. They do all the statistical research, and they have discovered that all growth is preceded by moments of disequilibrium. Change can follow. They're not the only ones who wrote about this, though. You've got Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You have scientists who come to a moment where they come to an impasse. They don't know how to get past this point, and that causes them then to dig deeper. And they cast their hypothesis, which, by the way, is an imaginative exercise. Imagination is important to the scientists. And then they do the tests, and if they find something, they portray it with depictions. Again, imaginative exercise. But nevertheless, the scientists are engaged in developmental understanding of particular things, the world we live in, and so on. But it wasn't that the scientists and the developmentalists came up with this. You can go back to Shakespeare. In one of his plays, he says, all the world's a stage, all the people are players, and we all play 7 parts. He talks about the mewling, puking baby, who we have to bear the stains for. And then he talks about the person who finally reaches a 7th stage, second childishness. Sans teeth, without teeth, sans hearing, sans eyes, when all of a sudden we start to recognize the world is closing in on us a little bit. But they weren't the only ones either. Because you go to Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. He says there is no growth without some upheaval of mind. My present conceptual framework was not sufficient to handle the incoming data, and I need to be open to change. There could be 2 kinds of change, at least. Change of kind, I have to scrap completely my old way of seeing, or a change of degree. The change of kind would be like chopping down the tree and making a chair out of it. The change of degree would be like the tree adding new rings. By the way, the tree doesn't have to give up the interior rings just because it adds more. C.S. Lewis says there is no real change if there's not continuity in the change process. So I'm growing, I'm benefiting, I'm taking with me. He says humans are not like a train that passes through one station, always leaving behind the stations where it's been. Human beings get to take with them the places where they've been. And we can feed on that at some degree like we could feed on a novel. We're reading the story of our past, and it matters. And God is in the recycle business. Don't toss away even the sorrows of your past. God is in those places as well. Remember Jacob? His family's falling apart. He's fleeing from a brother who wants to kill him. He sleeps with a stone as his pillow, and he has that dream all night long of the angels ascending and descending. And what does he say? When he wakes up after hearing the promise of God, that God will be with him and bring him back to that place, he says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't even know it. And he names the place Bethel, the house of God. And not only that, he's 20 years gone then, comes back with 2 wives, 2 concubines, 12 kids. Benjamin hadn't been born yet, but Dinah, his daughter, was among the 11 brothers. How would you like to be the younger sister to those 11 guys? And then he hears Esau's coming after him. Or at least he's coming with 400 troops. The last time he saw Esau wanted to kill him. So he divides his family into 2 groups. Names the place Manaim, 2 camps. Thinking Esau, who doesn't know his legacy, if he attacks here, maybe half of his legacy will survive. He's stressed. That's the night the angel of the Lord comes to him, and he wrestles all night with the angel of the Lord. His hip is dislocated. I wrestled in college. It's a horrible sport. It's not even, they should outlaw it, I think. Although it was kind of relaxing for me because I got to spend so much time on my back every day at practice. But nevertheless, the thing is, he wrestles all night. His hip's dislocated. And dawn breaks, and the angel of the Lord says, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. And tenaciously, he says, I won't let you go unless you bless me. And he gets the oddest blessing in the whole Bible. No longer do I call you Jacob the cheater. I will call you Israel. What does Israel mean? He who struggles with God. He who wrestles with God. Where's the blessing in that? Well, there's some development. In the moment of disequilibrium, there's development. And what does Jacob rename that place? Peniel, the face of God. C.S. Lewis said, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want my spouse, not my idea of my spouse. I want myself, not my idea of myself. We're all in processes of development, and it makes no difference what stage you are in life. There's still development to go on. None of us are very life-skilled. If you waited till you were ready to get married, you'd never marry. If you waited till you were ready to have children, the whole human race would have ended this generation. A child learning to walk falls down and gets bruised. A child taking the training wheels off the two-wheeler falls down and adds abrasions to those bruises. A child leaving the one-room school experience, going to middle school, and on the threshold of the most purgatorial period of human existence, adolescence, trying to navigate 6 classrooms and work the locker. Remember how horrible that was? And then by the time you graduated from middle school, you could do it with a blindfold. If you're not awkward someplace in your life, you're just not growing. So there's going to be a relative awkwardness to these things. We develop. Where else do we go for this? We go to the Bible. Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in wisdom and favor with God and man. Wisdom, intellectual development. Favor with God, spiritual development. Favor with man. That means there was sociological development. And also he grew in stature. There was physiological development. You go to 1 John 2:12 through 14. I'm writing to you children. The Greek word teknia, newborn babe. Just a toddler at best. Not a brephos, which is just out of the womb, but a toddler. Why? Because your sins are forgiven. What did you know when you came to faith? You didn't come to faith and say, oh, I get it now. Jesus is a perfect anthropotropic person manifest in the hypostatic union and the eschatological ground of all my hope. None of you said that. None of you were clear on Trinitarian doctrine. What did you know? Your sins were forgiven. Wow. And you don't have to let go of that as you mature in faith. And he says, I'm writing to you young men because you're strong. Word of God abides in you. I'm writing to you fathers because you know the one who's been from the beginning. You know him. You've walked with him. I'm in my 46th read through the Bible right now. And I've read the New Testament 31 times besides that. I've read through the whole of the New Testament at least once, some passages 60 times. Some passages harder. You got to keep a lexicon by you because some words, they're only used once or twice in the New Testament. You know how it is. But I'm going through my second read of the Greek Bible right now, 46 times. Every time I read through the Bible, I know you've had this experience. You say, where was that last time I read the Bible? And you just keep discovering things that sort of confirm to you that maybe there was an omniscience behind this book. And every time I read the Bible too, I see something, I go, how do I make sense of that? Complete conundrum to me. Well, like the scientist, I put it in the pending tray and I go on. Maybe another time or two reading through the Bible, I begin to see an answer emerge. And I go, wow. How many people have you ever met that said, oh, I read the Bible once, there's nothing in that book? And I go, I don't think you know the depths. You bailed too soon. You missed out. You did not develop in your understanding. Could you imagine a marriage, how long it would last if every time we saw some flaw in our spouse? I mean, they'll never see it in us, of course, but if we see a flaw in our spouse, if we just bailed? You see a conundrum in the scriptures, do you bail? You see a conundrum in your children, do you disinherit them? No, growth is going to come in those times. And then he writes more in that 1 John 2:12 through 14. I have written to you, children. Different name now. It's not teknia, it's paideia, child of teachable age. I've written to you, children, because now you're starting to know the Father. And what does it say in Hebrews? We'll come to that passage in a minute. In Hebrews 12, it says, every son loved by his father will be disciplined. Why? Because the Father doesn't want to leave us mewling and puking children. He wants us to grow. So the child of teachable age begins to understand some things about the Father that we didn't get to know right off the bat. I'm writing to you young men because you're strong and the Word of God abides in you. It echoes it, and it says, and you have overcome the evil one. In other words, you're beginning to see the Bible as a valuable resource for doing life. And then he says, I have written to you, fathers, because you know the one who's been from the beginning. Very powerful. We all know 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I thought of as a child. I reasoned as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. The Bible affirms these things. Why? Because it's the way God wired us. We shouldn't be surprised that the sociologists see it, the scientists see it. We couldn't be surprised that in the Middle Ages they saw it or an Elizabethan playwright saw it. We are in process of development. And since we're finite and in our understanding and fallen and very broken, and also living among others equally as flawed as we are, we're destined to suffer as we develop and mature. And of course, maturity is predicated on responding well to these difficulties. There's a book by Anne Lamott. Do any of you read her writings by any chance? Okay, so Anne Lamott, she wrote one of her novels. She's the one that wrote Traveling Mercies. That's the one where she says, I'll save a quote from that one later. But she wrote one novel called All New People. And it's about a girl coming of age in Marin County, north of San Francisco. That's where she grew up. I think there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in there. This girl is in a family where the father struggles with alcohol and he's a womanizer, and the mother is a Christian, but she's kind of crusty. She has faith, but it's a sort of rigid faith. And the girl is trying to make sense of life in this context. And one day the mother, who always has these adages for everything, the mother and the daughter are talking about the nature of grace. And the mother says, to ask what grace is like asking what a one-hand clap sounds like. And the daughter says, the Japanese have a proverb kind of like that. It's, what sound does rain make? And the Japanese answer, it doesn't make any sound till it hits something. An umbrella, a hat, or a puddle. And that part of the dialogue ends. And as a reader, you're saying, well, so what sound does grace make? And you enter into the story interactively, and you go, wow, if rain doesn't make a sound till it hits something, grace doesn't make a sound until it hits something. A broken heart, a broken life, an estranged relationship, something like this. So we're developing as creatures, but we're developing in a broken world as fallen creatures. I have a group that meets at my house every Thursday night from 9 o'clock till midnight. We've been meeting for years. Wheaton College had a standard that faculty couldn't drink or smoke. And I abided by the standard. I lived by it. I'm a rule keeper, not a rule breaker. But then they changed. And they said, faculty could smoke or drink. You can't color outside the lines, move towards drunkenness. We wouldn't want to do that anyway. And so this group emerged at my house where we light up pipes. I give everybody a thumb's width of single malt scotch, no bad blended stuff, just the good stuff. And we start off with a Robert Service poem. I have some friends, some honest friends, and honest friends are few. A pipe of briar, an open fire, and a book that's not too new. And we begin our discussion by somebody breaking out a poem. And we read poems, and we start talking about poetry. Grown men. Sometimes women come. We're not gender exclusive. But we start with poetry, and we start talking. It's great. There's 17 daughter groups of this group worldwide. There's 2 in Hong Kong. I was there to start both of them. One is made up only of millionaires, and the other one's made up only of billionaires. The billionaires don't like the millionaires coming to their group because they say they feel like they're always trying to get something from them. So we have these discussions going on at this particular group. Well, there's a guy named KJ Johnson who was a regular at our group, but he just moved to Atlanta recently. He's the director of the C.S. Lewis Institute in Chicago. He had been a Marine Corps officer and a helicopter pilot, deployed several times in some rough parts of the world. Tender-hearted guy. And KJ just came back to town because my wife even is at the C.S. Lewis Institute retreat this weekend. KJ's leading it. But he just lost his brother 3 weeks ago. And we're at the Pipes group last night, and we're talking, and the discussion that night turned to death and to grieving and to so on. And finally we decided, let's all pray for KJ. So we start praying for him, and I prayed for him, Lord, you promised that you would be the husband to the widow. You promised that you would be the father to the fatherless. Please, Lord, in like manner, be the brother to the brotherless. It was his only brother who passed away. The available resources of God's presence and the grace that hits something, the broken heart at the passing of a brother, the availability of those graces are no guarantee that our responses will be equal to the grace given. Our responses matter in these things. And I want you to take for a second, because we're going to talk about how we work through these conundrums. I want you to take for a moment, you don't have to answer me, but in your own mind, take an honest accounting. Think about the worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. You don't have to share it, but get it in your mind. You got it? Worst thing. Now think of the next worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Got it? Now think of the next worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Okay, now think of the next worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Now think of the next worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. Now think of the next worst thing that ever happened to you in your life. So many of you are smiling. This isn't the response I was expecting when we talk about horrible things. In reality, I have never gotten anybody to more than 10. And that's even giving lectures in Ceausescu, the Stalinist dictator's Romania, to a group of people. Every person in the room had been persecuted for their faith. That means even talking to a bunch of southern Sudanese refugees who were in Khartoum, every one of whom had seen relatives hacked to death by the Janjaweed. Nobody got to more than 10. You can get to maybe 20 or 30, but contrast it with this. Think of all the good things that have happened to you in your life. And my guess is that second list is going to go on and on and on and on. We're never surprised at the bad that occurs, because it's a broken, fallen world, and some of the brokenness and the consequences of that may be of our own making, some may be the consequences of somebody else's making. But when you think about the good that we've experienced, the bad we've experienced are errant brushstrokes painted on a massive canvas of good. But the next question is this: how many of you have seen some good come out of the bad that you experienced in your life? Maybe it was resolved. Maybe it wasn't resolved, but you grew some wisdom through that bad experience. I've got 8 really bad things in my life. I've seen good come from 5 of them. They weren't necessarily resolved, but I think I would even go back and say, probably when it comes to growth of understanding about life, those 5 things provided me some of the best lessons I ever had. It says in Hebrews that Jesus learned, there's development, learned obedience from the things he suffered. I don't like that verse. If he had to learn and he was sinless, we're not getting a pass. But there's somehow something that can come from these particular things. And I want to talk about the nature of these things and how that good can come from them and so on. As a matter of fact, if you ever come to a moment in your life where you have a bad experience and you say, I don't think any good will ever come from this, your own experience counts against such blanket judgment. If you meet a person who's suffering, says, I don't think good can ever come from this, you don't want to correct them. You want to pray for them, be present with them, love on them, and then maybe when the pain subsides a little bit, then you can sort of walk with them through the labyrinth of understanding. But nevertheless, our experience counts against the judgment, the universal judgment. No good could come from any kind of suffering that we may be enduring. This maturation process means we can learn more and more about the love of God even in a broken world, because surely the Lord is in this place and I didn't even know it. So how can the love of God begin to break through these difficult experiences? It says in Hebrews 12, 6a and 12, 10b, those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. He disciplines us for our good so that we may share in his holiness. It says later in that same chapter, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble. Oh, wow. That means that God has an end game. That through our pain, like Christ's pain on the cross, he wants something redemptive to be accomplished. Not just to us, but maybe beyond us to others as we become more empathetic or become more like Christ through these events. In Luke 22, 31 through 32, a passage, I was actually reading it this morning in my quiet time, but also it's a passage that when I've really attended to it, I didn't like it at all. Jesus is talking to Peter. It's at the upper room the night before he's going to be betrayed. And he says, Peter, Satan asked to sift you like wheat. And I want you to know I prayed for you. I don't like that. I'd rather have heard him say, Satan has to sift you like wheat, and I told Satan, keep your mitts off of him. He's mine. But he just says, I prayed for you. That when your faith is restored, you may be able to minister to the others also. Wow, there's some purpose now beginning to emerge in the suffering that we might endure. And this becomes extremely important, I think. Okay? So, in light of this, I want to give two major illustrations that begin to clarify how the love of God can seep through even in these difficult situations, maturing us, and the mark of our maturity would be deploying us to then be an ambassador of grace to others. Okay? First illustration. I would suggest to you that our lives are like an old phonograph record. Do you guys even remember what phonograph records were? Remember? Those little discs that had the grooves in them and you put them on a record player. My students have no clue what I'm talking about. I have to explain it or bring one in. Oh, yeah, vinyl. Yeah, we like vinyl. Okay, so you had the record, you put it on the record player, you put the needle on the record, and you started to play. And our lives are like that. We start to play out our themes. But invariably, in a fallen world, those records get scratched. And when the old records would get scratched, what would they do? Yeah, they'd go round, go round, go round, go round. They'd get stuck in that place. Developmental theorists actually have a term for this. They call it repetition in search of mastery. We want to develop past the stuck place somehow. They say that we look for surrogates with whom we can work these things out with. You're driving down the road, somebody cuts you off, you honk the horn, that's okay. But 20 miles down the road, you're still tailgating that guy, honking your horn, screaming obscenities at them. It's not about that person cutting you off. You've projected onto it something that's still broken in you and longs to be healed. 1 Corinthians 13:5. Love does not seek its own. What's the mark that we might be? It is not provoked. And the moment I find myself provoked beyond what the circumstances merit, it's probably touching me at my raw psychology where I'm broken and I haven't gotten past that place yet. Another one, you go to work and they hire somebody new at work and you don't get along with that person. Somebody says to you, why don't you like him? You hardly know him. I don't know, bad chemistry. Bad chemistry is probably more about something going on inside of us being played out in that relationship than it is about that other person. When it says in Genesis that a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife and the two become one flesh, my guess is this idea of leaving and cleaving also speaks of this kind of generational sins that come down. We enter into the relationship, and invariably your spouse will be a person on whom you're trying to work out this garbage. And you will be a person on whom they're trying to work out this garbage. And the quicker we can learn about this garbage, the quicker we could the quicker we could cease causing damage to one another. Okay, so these things are at play, and they can be in play in families, they can be in place at work structures, they can be in place in political structures, and so on. This just is a way we're kind of hardwired. Not only that, in light of our pain, these scratches in our record, we want to stop the pain. So when we're young, we gravitate towards what I would call anesthetizing behaviors. The anesthetizing behaviors do not get us better, but they get us by. They also put us in a little bit of control of stopping the pain. I had cancer in 2012, had some very, very serious surgery, and they gave me a morphine device where if the pain got really bad, I could just push the button. We go through our lives pushing the button, anesthetizing with something. Obvious anesthetizing behaviors: alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual addiction, eating disorders, workaholism. There could be some really interesting ones too, unique to us. I know a guy who creates chaos in his life, and everybody focuses on the chaos over there, so they're not looking at the chaos in him. It's his way of deflecting some of the pain. Have you ever been around Hell's Angel, hardline, biker type people? I haven't worked with a massive number, but I work with a number to see a pattern. Every one I got close to had a marshmallow heart. And the anesthetizing behavior is putting up the hard veneer so that people won't break through. Their heart had already been broken, so the protection was to distance themselves from other people. My guess is there might be as many anesthetizing behaviors as there are people in the world. But they fall into patterns, and we can classify them and that sort of thing. The interesting thing is, as we get older, we also pick up convictions that usually run against the grain of our anesthetizing behaviors. That's why you could see somebody preaching against some sin, and then all of a sudden they end up being found out, caught up in that sin. Why? They have the convictions, but they find themselves where Paul was in Romans 7, the very thing I desire to do, I don't do, and the thing I find myself doing, I don't want to do. I think the reason why is because our wounds are deeper than our convictions. Our wounds are deeper than our convictions. And we'll bail on the convictions just to stop the pain. You can look at a person until you're blue in the face and tell them they shouldn't be engaged in some activity or behavior. But if that activity or behavior is their artificial way of dealing with their deep wound, you're not going to win the battle. You got to heal it at the place of the disease. And in our own lives, we have to heal it at the place of the disease. And I think in light of this too, Paul says, I don't do the thing I want to do. I do the thing I don't want to do. Who will set me free? He says, Jesus Christ. Now we're moving towards some real relevancy for us as Christians. What's the answer that we can find in the scriptures that can heal us? Well, let me set it in context. I'm going to tell you the third worst story I've ever heard in all my years of working with other people. Third worst. And it's bad. And it's not my story, but it's one I'm very familiar with. Very familiar with the details. There's this kid, young man, and when he's about 6 years old, his mother dies, giving birth to a younger brother. I think he's going to have some abandonment issues. You know, C.S. Lewis's mother died when he was 9. Psychologists tell us if a child experiences real trauma before the age of 12, they've got some stuff to work through. Matter of fact, if they experience real trauma, they may have to work through identity issues centered around it. You can have a child that maybe dad left the family, and that child says, if I just would have done more, maybe dad would have stayed. Or another child, mom leaves the family, and the child says, I must be dirt. I wasn't enough to keep mom here. I must be of no value whatsoever. Another child says, that stuff hurt so bad, I wasn't in control. I will never be out of control again in my life. Have you ever met a high control person? Really hard to work with. But my guess is the control is masking some deep, deep pain. Be gentle with them. Be gentle with all these people. So I think C.S. Lewis's mother dies when he's 9. Well-meaning people at his church said, if you pray for her, she'll get better. Well, you could say pray for her, she might get better, but when you say she will get better and you give those guarantees, you're going to cause some problems. The God he will be rejecting will not be the God who is God, but the God of these people's configurement. He prayed hard, like her survival depended upon his prayers. He prayed as diligently as any 9-year-old could. She got worse. They said, pray harder, she'll get better. He prayed harder, she died. He says, there's nothing to this faith stuff. Later he would write, I want God, not my idea of God. I want God, not your idea of God either. I want the God who is. So anyway, this kid loses his mother when he's young, and my guess is he's probably got some issues. Abandonment issues of some sort. Not only that, he's raised in a very large family, and it's extremely abusive. Definitely emotionally abusive, definitely physically abusive. I don't think it was sexually abusive, but it was abusive. And he was the one singled out to get the brunt of the grunt. Usually in a family there is one, we'll call them the black sheep, but maybe they're not the black sheep. Maybe they're the ones who are the bad chemistry with the parent who hasn't worked through his or her stuff yet. Not always the case. The kid could be responsible and be a bad person. Who knows? It's complex. But nevertheless, this kid in this family is singled out for incredible abuse. When he's 17 years old, he's kicked out of the family, and he finds work, and he's smart and he's clever, and he moves up the ladder at his place of work. And finally, when he is at the top, as far as he can get, given his limited opportunities, at that particular moment, somebody files a sexual harassment charge against him, and he goes to prison for 7 years. I believe he was innocent. Goes to prison for 7 years. My college roommate, one of them, on his 6th anniversary, slit his wife's throat and murdered her. He went to prison for 3.5 years. This guy goes to prison for 7 years for trumped up charges that I'm convinced weren't true. Can this guy get better? He's got so many scratches in his record. Well, I hold up his story to you because he did get better. And you all know his story. Whose story did I just tell you? You all know it. I just told you Joseph's story in the Bible. Joseph's mother, Rachel, dies giving birth to Benjamin. And not only that, his brothers were really furious at him. Why were they so mad at him, and why did they treat him so horribly? Why? Huh? Jealousy, because he was the favored son of a father who should have known better, because his father was the unloved son of his father Isaac, who treated Esau better. But sins of the parents are visited on children, third and fourth generation. Jacob should have known better. Not only that, think about it from Simeon's point of view. How would you feel if you felt you were the unloved son? Or Reuben? Or Judah? Or Naphtali? There's enough sorrow in this story to go around. Matter of fact, there's enough sorrow in the story of humanity since the fall of man to go around. Life skill is to learn how to navigate that sorrow. And there will be tears in the process. But there will be some good that comes from it. Okay, so they sell him into slavery. When he's 17 to a bunch of Ishmaelites, he ends up in Potiphar's house. By the way, if I was God, and aren't you glad I'm not, I would not have prepared a guy to be the prime minister of a country by sending him to prison for 7 years. My heavens. I'd have gotten him an MBA at the Booth School at the University of Chicago. I'd have gotten him a law school at Harvard. I'd have gotten him an internship with, I don't know, Angela Merkel or something like that. And then I would prepare him for being the head of state someplace. But God sends him to prison, and as a peer of the fellow prisoners, puts him in charge of bringing order out of the chaos. You think some leadership skills weren't developed there? My word. But Potiphar's wife comes on to him. He doesn't cave. He's a hero, really. And he ends up getting sent to prison. I've always thought if you want to write a novel, write this one. What was it like the first time Joseph, when he's elevated second only to Pharaoh, goes to the party, the government party, and the Potiphars come in? And he's only one step below Pharaoh. I bet it would have been an interesting experience. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. And my guess is Joseph would have probably been magnanimous, like we see him all the way through. Well, anyway, he does get better, but how? How does he get better? And the Cliff Notes, or the Sparks Notes, are found in what he names his two children. The first son is named, does anybody know? Manasseh. Does anybody know what Manasseh means? Is there anybody in here that ever knew what Manasseh meant sometime in your life? You did. What's your name? Sue? All right, Sue. You're getting close. You used to know what's happened since you don't remember anymore. You're going to help me. I'm helping you. If you don't remember what happened. If you don't remember what his name means, what happened? You
remember. No. Forgot. I forgot.
I knew we could draw it out of you. That's exactly what the name means. I forgot. For he says, for God made it possible for me to forget what happened in my Father's house. What did he mean by that? You're brilliant. I knew it was back there. It's like Plato. Plato says that all these stuff is in us, and the philosopher's job is the job of midwifery, to help the person give birth to the things that are in there somewhere. So that's what we're doing. You did a great job. Okay, but how as we look at this, how did he mean that? When the brothers come to buy grain, Joseph recognizes them right away. He asks them, do you have any other brothers? There's 10 of them there. Why would he even be asking if they have more? Wouldn't that be enough, 10? But he's probably asking them because he knows that he had a younger brother, and he goes, I wonder if you did the same thing to him that you did to me. And they say they had another brother back home. That's a good sign. And then also, he asks them about their father. Doesn't say anything about a mother. Sounds like a guy who knew his mother had died. Later, he'll give them a banquet, and he seats them in chronological order of their birth. He remembers details. What did he mean? Forget. And he said, for the Lord made it possible for me to forget what happened in my Father's house. I believe it means he was able to forgive to the forget place, where it didn't hold him anymore. So C.S. Lewis says everybody thinks forgiveness is a great idea until they have somebody to forgive. And it's tough. Let's say you go on a long drive. Let's say you got a long drive to Chicago. Your karma. You had me drive up here, you get to drive to Chicago, right? So you go to Chicago and you decide you're not going to turn on the radio or anything. Your mind will gravitate towards unresolved pain. You'll go back in that dark room and you'll remember. And you may get mad all over again. And then you may get sad all over again. And then it may be that after a couple of hours, it morphs into forgiveness. Forgiveness is like grief. When my older brother died at 48, he had saved my life from a near drowning accident when I was in junior high. He's the one who took me to the meeting the night I became a Christian. And he died. This man marked my life. My family says, you need to preach his funeral. So I preached his funeral. Do you think I walked away from that funeral and said, well, that's over with. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that now. No, I cried about his death every day for 2 years. When my sister's husband died at 50, and I was asked by the family to preach his funeral, I wept about that. I called my sister every day, and we talked on the phone every day for 2 years. Forgiveness is like grief. Something was taken from you. A life without scratches on your record. And unless you're doing the grief work along with the forgiving work, you're probably not forgiving as adequately as you might. When somebody says, I'll forgive you, but I'll never forget, there's a person who's not willing to enter into the emotional letting go. A couple weeks later, you have a 2-hour drive, and you revisit the place. Takes 2 hours again. Next week, 2 hours again. Next week, 2 hours again. C.S. Lewis said when Jesus said, don't forgive 7 times, forgive 70 times 7, it may take 490 attempts at one bad thing before you get past that one bad thing. But it's worth the effort because you don't want to live your life stuck in that repetition in search of mastery. You want to break free. Next time it takes an hour and 45 minutes. Next time it takes an hour and 30 minutes. Next time it takes an hour and 15 minutes. Next time it takes 45 minutes. Next time it takes 3 hours. You had a relapse. Well, you know what happened? You eventually come to the place where the memory of the thing and the forgiveness become a single act. And at that moment, Manasseh is born. Doesn't hold you anymore. Anne Lamott said bitterness, which is a consequence of unwillingness to forgive. That's the one you guys that had read Anne Lamott back there. That's the one where she says in Traveling Mercies, bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. Okay? So second son. What's the second son's name? Ephraim. What does it mean? Be fruitful. Get on with purposive activity. Live through the pain and the forgiveness that you might be deployed as a fruitful person ministering empathetically towards others because you understand how life works. It's kind of interesting. So I had a young woman, she came to my office one day, knocks on the door. No, she didn't knock on the door. She just burst in. And she said, Jerry, I've got to talk with you. I've got to talk with you. I said, yeah, what's up? She's so excited. She said, I was in chapel today. All my life I have struggled with performance stuff. All my life. Today I heard in chapel a message that told me that God loved me the way I am and I didn't have to do anything to earn it and I didn't have to struggle with performance anymore. I said, that is incredible. Let's pray. And we worshiped Jesus for what this young woman had discovered that day in chapel. After we prayed, I looked at her and I said, now I'm curious. You said you've struggled with this all your life. What's that about? She said, well, I suppose you're going to tell me it's my parents. I said, I'm not going to do anything of the sort. I don't know. I asked the question because I was curious. She said, well, my sister thinks it's my parents. I said, I haven't said anything to you about your parents. You've defended them twice. What's that all about? Well, the dam broke. I looked at the clock. And for 20 minutes, she told me about growing up on the mission field in a missionary family with a father who controlled by attention. You did what he wanted, he would give you kudos. You did what he didn't like, he wouldn't sometimes talk to her in the house or even acknowledge her presence for up to 3 weeks. Here's a young girl in her adolescence who needs father affirmation, and she's treated like that? And after 20 minutes of her talking about it, and the decibel level got higher and higher. And also, she said she was trying to deny that it was her parents at first, and I realized there's a lot of stuff here stuffed. And she says, I don't think I'll ever be able to love my parents. I said, that's not an option available to you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, 20 minutes ago you came in here and told me that you just learned that God loved you not based on your performance, and now you're going to tell me you're going to withhold love to your parents based on their performance? If you're really understanding what Jesus' love is like, you're going to be no respecter of persons as to who you're going to give grace and love to. Okay, that's the first image. Second image, second illustration. I think we all have to pass through 3 rooms developmentally. If there's 3, there may be 303, but I want to focus on 3 rooms. And the first room I'm going to call the Goodwill Hunting room. Did you ever see that movie? Can't recommend it. The language is so horrible. But the problem with it, by the way, it's the only movie Robin Williams won an Academy Award for, playing the psychologist Sean. And it was a brilliant, brilliant role. But it's not gratuitous language. It's the way rough and tumble guys in South Boston might talk. It's gratuitous when you got 9-year-old girls of bad news bears who are on the softball team who are talking like drunken sailors. That's just to get a rise out of the audience. It's messing with us. You don't need that stuff. It's gratuitous. But here are these guys. There's several themes going on in that movie. But there's one particularly, well, 2 probably particularly that we have to account for. Actually, let me give you all the themes real quick. How many of you have seen the movie? Okay, probably 60% of you. If you haven't, I'll just rehearse it for you. There's this kid, and he grew up in South Boston. He's been a product of the foster care. He's been horribly abused all of his life. And he is at an Einstein-level genius. This guy is absolutely brilliant. And he's a custodian at MIT. He has his best friend, played by Ben Affleck. It's Matt Damon who plays the part. And his best friend, by the way, do you know they flipped a coin to see who would play what part? I can't imagine it working the other way. But anyway, nevertheless, his best friend, there's a relationship between him and his best friend, and they've been buddies since kids, and he will never abandon him. He doesn't have a family, but this is his family. There's this professor, teaches at MIT. He's won an award better than he won the Fields Medal. It's better than the Nobel Prize for mathematics. He's as arrogant as all get out. Talk about pretense, this is the guy. He comes to class, a tiered classroom, and he says, I put a problem out on the board, out in the hall. I don't expect any of you will be able to figure it out. But if by chance any of you happen to figure out this problem before the semester's over, I can get you a job with 6 figures right out of college. Then they come to class the next day, the problem's solved. Professor says, who did this? Who did this? And nobody will answer. They know if they do, he'll give them another problem they won't be able to answer. They come to class the next day, he says, I've got one out there that took me 6 months to answer. None of you guys will be able to figure this out. But the gauntlet is drawn. Let's see what you can do with that, smarty pants. The next day they come to class and it's answered. And he realizes he's in the presence of genius. He puts another one up there. And his TA, who's working late at night, sees that it's the custodian, Will Hunting, who's answered the problem. He wants to get a hold of Will Hunting, but he can't get a hold of him because Will Hunting violated his probation and he's in jail. Professor finds out about it and he goes to the judge and he says, I want you to release him to me. And the judge says, if you get counseling for him, I'll release him to you. So the MIT professor takes him to all these highfalutin psychologists who are equally as pretentious as he is. And Will Hunting reads their books the night before and ties them all in knots when they come in. He's got one last hope, his old college roommate. But his college roommate hasn't amounted to anything. You see, rather than becoming a highfalutin psychologist, he went back to the old neighborhood. And he teaches at a community college. Can you imagine a Harvard grad compromising himself to teach at a community college like that? And he has a little practice on the side. And his last-ditch effort, the professor takes Will Hunting to Robin Williams' character, Sean. He says, I want to know if you'll meet with him. And he said, who'd you take him to already? Oh, no, you didn't take him to him, did you? No, you didn't take him to him, did you? Oh, no, how could you have done it? I'll see him. So Will Hunting comes in. And in about 20 minutes, he has Robin Williams tied in knots. And Robin Williams has Will Hunting by the throat. And Will Hunting says, counseling session is over. Robin Williams knows he got his goat. Okay, because he's got scratches in his record too, right? He says to the professor, I'll see him next week, and I don't want you around. The next week, Will Hunting comes. Robin Williams says, let's go for a walk. They walk to Boston Gardens. They sit on a bench. There are ducks lazily swimming by and the swan boats pedaling by. And all of a sudden, Robin Williams says to him, you are really smart. You have Einstein level genius. But all of your knowledge you've gained from books. You've read about art, but you don't know what it's like to be in the Sistine Chapel and see the vibrancy of those colors and smell what that room smells like. You've read about war. Robin Williams, a Vietnam War veteran. You've read about war, but you don't know what it's like to sit in a field after a battle, cradling your best friend's head in your lap while he bleeds to death. You've read about love. But you don't know what it's like to be by the bedside of the woman you love most in the world while she's dying of cancer and all the doctors know that the signs that say visiting hours are over don't apply to you. And Robin Williams says, you're an orphan, aren't you? Will Hunting says, yeah. Hangs his head, yeah. He says, what would you think if I told you, oh, I know all about that. I read Oliver Twist once. He says, I want to know you. And I can't get to know you unless you let me inside. The next week, Sean comes, doesn't say a thing the whole time. The professor, so the second line of relationships, it's Will Hunting and the professor, and then the professor and Robin Williams have this relationship. Oh, and there's also Will Hunting and his friend Ben Affleck. So the professor comes after the third appointment, and he says to him, did you fix him yet? Did you fix him? Why? Because the professor wants to use the kid. The kid's used to being used. And Robin Williams says, he didn't say a thing the whole time. The professor says, is that good? Robin Williams says, very impressive, actually. Why was it impressive? If I don't give you, Robin Williams, what you want, will you abandon me like everybody else? Why should I hang in there with you? There comes a love interest, Matt Damon and Minnie Driver. But eventually, in most of the movie, these counseling sessions with Robin Williams, there comes a time when trust is built, real depth is built, his detachment disorder is developed and worked through. And what is the telling line in the movie? The most poignant line in the movie. What is it? Robin Williams comes and he throws these pictures on a counter. And they're all pictures of abuse from Matt Damon's file, Will Hunting's file. It's got knife wounds. It's got bruises, cuts, places where cigarette butts were put out in his eye. And Will Hunting says to the counselor, "Do you know about this?" He says, "Yeah, I do." He says, No. Do you know about this?" And Robin Williams says, "Yeah, I do. I went through this." And they talked about the abuse in their families. And finally, Robin Williams says to the Will Hunting character, remember the line? "It's not your fault." So memorable. It's not your fault. And Will Hunting laughs it off and says, "Yeah, I know. He doesn't know. That's a subterfuge. He has to say it again. "It's not your fault." I know. It's not your fault. "I know. It's not your fault." Stop messing with me, man. The soul cyst is lanced. The pus comes out. And he falls in Robin Williams' arms, weeping and weeping and weeping. All of us need to come to the "it's not your fault" moment in our life. We've all picked up garbage in a broken, fallen world. My best friend at Wheaton College is Mark Lewis, the guy I went to the art museum with. He used to be in the soap operas. His wife was in the soap operas. They acted on Broadway. Brilliant actor and so on. And he's a great guy. He was the last born child in a missional family. He was born in Argentina. All his family went into some form of ministry and stuff. His father was a kind-hearted man. I knew his dad, but he was rigid, somewhat fundamentalist in his faith and not very flexible. Who knows what his story was? But Mark was an artist. There was no room in his father's mind for how an artist fit in his understanding of how the world should operate. So Mark is home by himself one day, or one of the older siblings was supposed to be watching him. He was about 6, and he's by himself. And so what does he do? He wants to show his parents how much he loves them. They've never really noticed his proclivities, his unique wiring. They've never affirmed it in him. So he spends the day, wherever the older sibling was who's supposed to be watching him. You know how that goes. He ends up getting out his crayons, his paints, his felt tip markers, his colored pencils, and he spends the entire day drawing a mural up the white wall of the back room of their house. And the whole time he's thinking to himself, when Dad and Mom see this, they're going to know finally how much I love them. And he kept thinking, they're going to bring in the neighbors, and they're going to say, "Look how much Mark loves us." Which one of us would have been smart enough to say, "You know what, Mark, we can't have that whole thing there, but you know what? We're going to get a frame, and we're going to put it over this much. We'll have to paint over the other, but man, oh man, thanks for giving us this gift." Who would have been to that speed? Well, he said he got what for? He got spanked. But he said the worst thing for him was not that he got spanked, but that his parents never saw what he was trying to show them. Fast forward, he's doing the autumn play years later. And his daughter, his days would be get up early, go to school, teach classes, faculty governance meetings, student appointments, grading papers, all that stuff. Comes home for 1 hour for dinner, and then he has to go back for rehearsals that go long into the night. He's been doing this for 3 or 4 weeks now. He's weary and tired. He comes home, he's sitting in the chair, and all of a sudden he sees his 6-year-old daughter, Ruby, standing on a chair with a plastic basin in the sink, just filling it up with water splashing everywhere. Mark says, "I came home for rest. I got to clean up this mess." "Ruby, honey, what are you doing?" Ruby bursts into tears. And Mark's wife, Mary, says, "Mark, she knew you were weary. She's just getting water to wash your feet." Immediately he flashes back to his own experience. He says, "Oh, honey, forgive me. I am so sorry. Let me help you." Said it was the coldest water he ever put his feet in his life. Why does that story move us so deeply? Mark said, "My parents didn't get it right. I got it half right. Maybe one day Ruby will get it all right." It moves us because we've all been the one who was misunderstood. It moves us because we've also been the one who did the misunderstanding. In his book, Blue Like Jazz, Donald Miller says when he was a boy, he was always in the outs, the perimeter of his social set at his high school. He longed desperately to be accepted by the peer group. One day he was at home and he read a poem and he liked the poem, he memorized it. 3 weeks later, somebody said something in the peer group, and he says, oh, that reminds me of a poem. And he recited it from memory, and the other kids looked at him and said, Miller, you are smart. You are really smart. My heavens, Miller, you are smart. So first time in his life he felt good about himself. He said, but what he realized from that experience, one, is he started memorizing more poetry after that. And the second thing he realized was that he needed to gain a sense of self based on how other people saw him, but everybody he looked to was as insecure as he was. Wow. It's not your fault. You don't have to define yourself by what the world's projected on you. You get to redefine yourself based on how God sees you, and he loves you. If you vector out after the first room, you are a danger to society because you will have an excuse for everything you do bad. You'll say, well, it wasn't my fault. I had this bad upbringing, or it wasn't my fault. I had this jilted love relationship, or it wasn't my fault. I was cheated by a partner, or whatever. We go through our life making a victim of ourselves. There's a second room you have to pass through, and the second room is a horrible room. It's just a horrible, horrible room. I call it just simply the dark room. And it's when we have to discover what is our fault. I remember the Good Will Hunting moment in my life. I pastored a church. It was a terrible situation. If purgatory exists, I worked off all my time during those days. It was in Santa Barbara, California, though. If God calls you to go through purgatory, pray he takes you to Santa Barbara. It was a beautiful place to do all this stuff. And my wife got beat up as well, and it was just horrible. And so consequently, my wife started to get a bounce back to herself again. And I didn't. I was just too beat up. And she said to me one day, Jerry, why don't you go with me to counseling? I think it would help me if you went. I said, okay, if we can help you, I'll go. How arrogant is that? So we go to counseling, and all of a sudden some digging goes on. And things that I had stuffed and things that I had basically rationalized or justified about my own family experience, it had just been stuffed. But during that time, I start thinking. When I was a boy, I have my older brother who died young. He was always sickly. And my mother was always concerned about him. We were poor. She couldn't get him to the doctor, really. If he'd have asthma problems, we had a little tiny house. It was probably about as big as about that much up to where the palms are. I mean, it was just little. We all lived in it. And she would take him into the bathroom and put towels at the where the doors came and turn on all the hot water so that the steam would go so he could start to breathe a little bit. And I remember my brother saying, am I going to die? Am I going to die? It was just sad, And so then I had cough. My sister, I get about every year I get this bad cough. My sister thinks maybe I have some bronchial stuff or something. I don't know. But I would cough and my mother would beat me. And I think that she thought, I can't handle it with one child. Look at it from her perspective. You're okay. You're just trying to get attention or something, she'd say. And she'd beat me. I'd have to run to my room, put my face in my pillow and cough on my pillow so I wouldn't get beat. I would be down for a nap from noon until dinner when I was little. When I started school, I didn't have to do that. One time I was down for a nap and she came in the room. I'd gone and gotten a teddy bear and was with a teddy bear. And she came in and said, how did you get that toy? I said, I went over there and got it. She said, you got out of your bed and I told you not to get out of bed. And she beat me. So when I come home from school, I didn't want to go in the house. The rules would always change. And whatever it is with my mom, later I figured it out. She was a dear person. She had a lot of good in her. I don't want to portray her badly. I'm trying to tell my story, not so much demean her for her story. And so what ended up happening was when I came home, I wouldn't go in the bathroom. I wasn't born with a sense of smell. I didn't know poop smelled. If I had to pee, I'd go behind the garage. If I had to poop, I'd just mess in my pants. And my mother would always catch me, and I didn't know how. She had radar cameras or something like that. And so she would try and break me of the habit by taking the soiled underwear and wiping it in my face. And I'd be stuck at a toilet, and I'm washing off the stuff in the toilet, and I'd say, I must really be bad. I must really be bad. You're not saying, Mom should get to a therapist and figure this stuff out. So my sister came with me a couple times to therapy sessions. She was 8 years older. And she comes to therapy sessions, and she starts telling stuff that I didn't even know about. I was just too young. And my sister is bawling her eyes out. And the therapist says, Kathy, why are you crying? And Kathy says, I lived in that house, and there was nothing I could do about it. And my heart broke for her. It's just a broken, sad world. The Simeons, the Kathys, the moms, the sons. And there came that moment when the therapist said, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You don't have to define yourself by that dysfunction. And I was weepy for 2 weeks. And then I went back to the therapist because I knew there was another room. Richard Rohr said, pain not transformed is transferred. Or the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And I went to the therapist and I said, I've heard people who have been hurt can hurt. It's just not always the case, but frequently enough it is. Why? Because we pick up by contagion. Luke 6:40, pupil fully trained will be like his teacher. Doesn't mean we know what the teacher knows, but we pick up by contagion the attitudes and values of the teacher. And I said, wow, well, I think I need to look at this to see if I've hurt other people, if there's collateral damage. And so I started thinking through my parenting. No problem. If my kids didn't get great grades, I wasn't upset. I got my first D in 3rd grade. Failed a class in college, failed a class in grad school. I wasn't the disciplinarian who got upset about grades. I didn't worry about their rooms being cleaned up. But my one son, my oldest son, he has an IQ of 178, really bright guy. And he would do stuff where his friends would start making fun of him. He would lick his lips, I'd get him chapstick. He'd lick his lips and lose the chapstick and he'd get the scab on his face. I'd drop him off at school and see his friends pointing to him, laughing at him. And it drove me nuts. I'd see them go running off in their group and he was always shuffling off by himself. I said, Jeremy, I don't want you doing this. You've got to do this other stuff. And I went ballistic in my discipline of him on that issue. And when I said to you, I would still hug him, but I had lost my temper. And I was too harsh on his discipline. And I did badly. And I'm scratching his record. And I'm realizing it. And I go to my son. He was 15 at the time. He's 39 now. But this was the age he was when I finally saw this stuff. I said, Jeremy, I want to tell you about 4 generations in our family. And I told him about the dysfunction that came down, each generation. And I said, and I wanted to make you feel like you were not marginalized by your friends. And I had no idea I was making you feel marginalized by your own father. Jeremy, I was wrong. Will you please forgive me? And we burst into tears. And we wept and wept for 2 hours. We wept together, holding each other. The next day I went back and I asked his forgiveness again. And the next day I went back and asked his forgiveness again. 2 weeks every day. At the end of 2 weeks he said, Dad, I get it. I still bring it up with him once in a while. I say, you know what, Jeremy, that wasn't about you. About a year later I said, can I tell the story? And he said, yeah, and I was speaking at a gathering, and he was sitting up in the balcony. And I told the story. I was very conscious of him up there as I told it. And there were people who had tears in their eyes. They wanted to talk afterwards. They come up. He comes walking down real fast. I can see him. He's walking lickety-split down the aisle. And I'm standing there talking to somebody. I'm aware he's coming. He comes and he stands right next to me, and he puts his hand on my shoulder while I'm talking. You see, it was one thing if I asked him and confessed it in private. It's another thing if I owned it publicly. It wasn't his fault. Now, my daughter got her doctorate in psychology. I'm sure I drove her to it. And while she was in her doctoral studies, she was supposed to go to a counseling event with every member of the family. I told my wife, man, this is cool. I'm going. I'll own whatever she wants to bring up. I'm all for it. And we go to the counseling thing, and she starts talking about those events with her brother. I said, Alicia, it's true that stuff happened, but none of that happened to you. She said, Dad, I lived in that house, And I heard echoed in her words, the words that had broke my heart when I heard my sister utter them. And all of a sudden, I said, "Oh, Alicia, I had no idea. Please forgive me. Please forgive me." And we wept and wept. The dark room is a hard room, but it's also the doorway to the third room, which is a brilliant room. You see, in the dark room, you catch yourself saying to yourself, "I was doing the best I knew how." None of us have been given great life skills, I think. Some better than others. Some families they don't have. I've seen non-Christian families who have the benefit of maybe 3 generations ago they were Christians, and there's been good stuff that's come down even still, even though that maybe this present generation doesn't know Jesus. I've seen families that are just godly people, but they've got garbage. Well, anyway, while I'm asking my kids for forgiveness, in my own mind, I'm saying, if you only knew, I was doing the best I knew how. You don't tell that to the person you're asking forgiveness for because it sounds like you're softening the thing. So I said, I was doing the best I knew how. And the light went on. I say it to myself, not to them. The light goes on. Guess who else was doing the best they knew how? My mother. And all of a sudden, the forgiving accelerates backwards. Wow! She had a story. I started talking to her as she aged, and I would try and talk to her cryptically. She didn't like to talk about stuff. But I started getting it out of her. I'd ask her, "Hey, how was it with Aunt Esther? How did it go with Aunt Ruth?" Aunt Ruth was a very bitter person. Her brother Donald. How did it go with him? Uncle Donald was, if you saw the movie L.A. Confidential, the Kevin Spacey character, I'm confident, was modeled after him. He was with the LAPD, Hollywood Detective Division. He's the guy who brought in Carol Chessman, that horrible criminal. And he won the Policeman's Medal of Valor for a sudden death shootout on Hollywood and Vine. Had scars on his face from the gun going off right in front of his face, and he moved away and so on. And then before he died, he took his .38 service revolver. Before he blew out his brains, he says, "If my mother's in heaven, it's the last place I want to go," and he killed himself. And the thing was, that was my mother's brother. And I start saying, "Tell me about Uncle Donald." And all of a sudden I start putting this piece together of huge and horrible abuse that she had to endure. And I start looking at her in a different light, and I start saying, she was a hero for how much she filtered out. But nobody can filter it all out if we're not going the forgiveness route, it seems to me. And so when the acceleration goes backwards to forgive, who's the first person you become empathetic towards? Besides those you hurt, the ones who hurt you. And now all of a sudden you're ready to go into the third room, and the third room is the wounded healer room. It's a light room. Because after Manasseh is born, forgive and forget, he wants Ephraim to be born, to be fruitful, to go into the broken world, cultivating some life skills and making it work. Well, I have one last quote to give you and explain it, and we're done. The quote is this. Jerry Sitzer, who's a church historian and a theologian, history of doctrine at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington. He says, "We're most like God in the world when we're most unlike him in relationship with him." We're most like God in the world when we're most unlike him in relationship with him. What does he mean by that? Well, God alone is independent. Self-existent, necessary being. So if he's alone, independent, how do I come to him? If I come to him unlike him, utter dependence upon him. That I might then go into the world more like him, independent of the world, so I could be a giver rather than a taker, a server rather than a user. I catch myself in a moment of unloveliness. I go to God who is love, unlike him, drawing on the rich reservoir of his unconditional love. I then, in my unloveliness, knowing that I'm still loved, go back into the world seeking forgiveness of the people I might have hurt and loving people as close as I can approximate as a fallen, broken human, some sort of unconditional love. I catch myself in a moment of unforgivingness. I go to him unlike him, receive from his forgiveness that I might go into the world more like him. I catch myself in a moment of impatience. I go to him, receive from him his patience, that I might, moving in that direction, might become more patient in the world. And so there it is. There's spiritual development, and it's rooted in the love of God. Okay? That's it.
So, well, I think we have a few minutes for some questions and discussion. So, does anybody have anything they'd like to
There's one over
ask
there.
about? Oh, Larry, you want to go
Larry.
around this way, Larry?
46. Well, in the New Testament, 31.
How many different versions have you read?
Lots of different versions. All the English versions that I've encountered, translations, are good, except one. The New World Translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's abysmal. Every page has got mistranslation stuff. But I know the translators of the NIV, the New American Standard, and the ESV. I know many of them personally, and they're good guys. But I also know where their hobby horses are. I know where their goofiness is. And you can get a passage of scripture where you could go this way or that way in the Greek. And I know why they choose to go this way or why they choose to go that way, because they brought something to those passages. They don't bring it to every passage, but just the ones where it maybe affects their issues. So you want to smooth out those wrinkles, because they're all good translations, but every once in a while you'll come with a little wrinkle here. Then read several translations, and it smooths out the wrinkles, and you benefit from it. And you'll probably find one or two translations that are your go-to translations, and you read them more frequently. That's been my experience. But the one I prefer the most is the New American Standard Version. And I wish I could say the Greek is good in there. The translation of the Greek is good. But the biggest reason why I prefer it is because it was the one that was handed to me when I was a new Christian. And the guy that was the head of the Lockman Foundation that produced the New American Standard, his name was Sam Sutherland. He was once asked, which translation is the best translation? And everybody's thought that he was going to say, New American Standard, we produced it, go buy it, and all that stuff. He said, whichever one you'll read. And I think that's probably the answer I would give. But I go to this other one more frequently. But ESV, NIV, New King James, who am I leaving out? Moffat translation I read because I'm a C.S. Lewis guy. Lewis read the King James, the Greek, and the Moffat. So I wanted to read the Moffat to see what his experience was reading it and so on. Anyway. First name?
Mary.
Mary. That's a good name. Jesus' mother liked it.
Well, anyway, do you have any comments about if there are people who live their life practicing diversion?
Practicing
Diversion.
diversion. They try to sort of brush.
Well, like I read an article, I took my husband to a pain seminar. My husband has a lot of pain. I don't have any pain. But in Arthritis Today, the magazine, had a good article. So I raised my hand, and I said, well, it said in Arthritis Today that if a person practices like a hobby, which, and they practice that, it says they don't feel the pain. I wondered if they would make a comment. And the man said, that's living your life in diversion. And I say, do you have any comment on that practice?
Well, I would say two things. If it's physical pain and it gets your mind off of it, that may be a good thing, right? If it's physical pain. If it's psychological or spiritual pain, my guess is that's not going to help you. It will be like an anesthetizing behavior. Because the only way you can get to that would be to mend the wound by grieving and forgiving. Now, obviously, if you had physical pain, you said your husband has pain, he doesn't know exactly what it is. If you could heal the arthritis or you could heal whatever's the cause of the pain, you'd prefer that over the diversion.
But one thing I would like to say, and the reason why I brought this up is because after saying what I have said, I realized I've lived my entire life in diversion with massive hobbies of all kinds. But I never felt any pain.
So the diversion has been maybe due to developmental pain that you experienced when you were a child?
Because I'm addicted to all these things that I have so much joy in doing.
Well, it could be an anesthetizing behavior. It may not be. It may be that you're a creative person. So I don't want to in any way suggest that because of these hobby interests. But one way you can find out, stop doing the hobbies for a month. and journal how you feel.
Well, that's what I wondered if you wouldn't have something.
Yeah, there are things you can do. If you can, we tend to do two things to cope with our pain if we don't cope with it in Christ. One thing we do is the anesthetizing behavior. The other thing we do is we lose it. Lose it, get upset. Extroverts tend to get angry or anxious. Introverts tend to get depressed, which is anger turned inward, or anxious. So if you know what you do when you anesthetize, so let's say it is the hobbies. The hobbies just could be the way God wired you and you're a creative person.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, but stop for a month. And if it bugs you beyond what it should, it's probably indicating that you've removed the anesthetizing behavior. Now what's going on? So what we do is we journal. I'll have my students take any time for about 2 months. I'll have them journal. If they lose it, if they're introverted and they get depressed for some reason more than the situation merits, or gets angry, flies off the handle more than the situation merits, gets anxious beyond what the situation merits, or they find themselves going to their anesthetizing behavior, to drink, to drugs, to sexual activity, whatever, all the salacious stuff that kids are being sucked into the vortex on, or if they workaholism, leave the home because it's easier to go bust your britches at work than to be at home and face whatever the difficulty might be there. When you find yourself going to the anesthetizing behavior or losing it, however you do, put a number down in your journal, write the date, and write no more than 5 sentences as to what happened, enough so that you'll be able to recall it. Because if you journal the first time and you journal for 5 pages, the next time you won't journal because you don't have enough time. So you journal 5 sentences. Maybe 6 at most. And then after 2 months, you go back and you look at these things. And you end up classifying them. 1, 5, 7, 13 were when I felt marginalized by the people I was with, like I didn't matter. 2, 6, 9, 12 were when I felt like expectation was placed upon me, and with the expectation, ambiguity was given in those contexts. And I lost it because I got anxious because I didn't know what to do. Expectation, not knowing what to do. So you classify that. Maybe you come up with 2 to 5 classifications at the end of the day. Then give a term for that, right? Anxiety, ambiguity, marginalized, whatever it might be. That now becomes the pointer back into your past. And you say, where in my life did I experience something really traumatic along that line? And all of a sudden the memories start to come up. And now you start praying. There's a prayer, the Anglicans use, it's called the Theophostic prayer. Do you know it? Theos is God, phos is light. So you pray the light of God on some area in your life. And you pray that God will bring it to light so you can grieve it and forgive it. Not so that you can be angry at the person. That doesn't help. So my youngest son, when he was getting married, my wife wanted to have the rehearsal dinner at the house. Well, that meant a million chores. You got to paint, you got to make sure the landscaping's perfect, you got to do all this stuff. And it was right when finals were going on. And we were going to have the wedding about 2 weeks later. So my whole life is a honey-do list and grading papers and grading exams. And what I would do is I'd do 5 papers graded. Then I'd go do something on the honey-do list. Then I'd go back and grade 5 more papers on the honey-do list. And I'm going on like this. And my wife is running hither, thither, and yon, doing all kinds of things she thought were important. And I wash my own clothes. And so I said, Claudia, I'm going to wash my clothes. Would you like me to wash your clothes? She says, no. If you wash my clothes, you'll throw my underwear in with the towels. Okay, I won't wash your clothes. So a while later, she comes in. I'm in my office studying. And she says, Jerry, come here. I go in the washroom. And our washing machine at that time would measure out how much water it needed based on how heavy the load was. It was a real high-tech washing machine that came with the house when we bought it. And she pulls out towels. And then she reaches in and pulls out her underwear. And I just started crying. I'm not supposed to do that. I'm a high T on the Myers-Briggs. I don't know how it happened. I know I didn't do it intentionally. I think maybe I had the two towels in there, and I think she might have come back from something she was done, threw her underwear in there. I want to blame her, right? You know, the great gospel hymn, "Take my wife and let me be." So I think maybe that happened, but bottom line is, towels and underwear were in there, and I was the only one at home, and I started crying. And my reaction was more than the situation merited. I mean, we could have laughed about it. I'm a doofus once again, you know, something like that. I'm weeping, way over the top than what this deserves. I go in my office, and I say, Lord, there's more here. Please shine your light on what's going on in my heart. And a memory came to my mind that I hadn't remembered since I was probably 7 or 8 years old. We were living in Arizona for a couple of years. We went there for my older brother's health. And I'm standing in a rocking chair. So I can't be but 4 or 5 years old. My younger brother would have been 2 or 3 years old. We're standing in the rocking chair rocking. My mother's ironing. My father's sitting on the couch watching TV. Sliding glass door in the back of the house. And we're rocking, and we go right through that door. And glass everywhere. My mother runs over, grabs me, and just starts beating on me. And she picks up Jimmy, and she says, Jimmy, are you okay? Are you okay? And that memory came to my mind. And here I'm feeling a bit marginalized, not by a wife who's cruel to me, but a situation that allowed me to enter into the repetition and search of mastery. And recognized there's a wound there. And I went out and I told my wife that story, and she said, I've never heard that story before. I said, I haven't thought about it since I was a kid. And yet it percolated in that event. That's why I was weeping. And now I have a new place where I get to grieve and forgive and maybe even see where maybe I've done some things like that to others because I picked up by contagion a similar kind of activity. So these things are not things to beat us up. These are things to help us get better and grow. And I think the full circle comes when we look at our own garbage, how we might have transferred things like this, and when we also find that we're able to forgive the person who might have hurt us and be empathetic for whatever. When was she ever in a situation where she got beat and by contrast others were nurtured and encouraged? I don't know. But I think that you do the journals and then say, where does it point back to these events? And you'll find places you have to grieve and forgive. And you get better. It's kind of cool. Say it again. It's called theophostic. Phos, it would be F-O with a line over it, S, sigma. Phos is the word for light. Photon, we call that a particle of light is a photon. It comes from that Greek word. And theophostic. So theos is God. So theophostic be T-H-E-O-F-H-O-S-T-I-C, I think, would be where it would be theophostic. But the Greek words are theos and phos. P-H-O with a line over S. And it means just pray the light of God to the place where the brokenness is. And maybe then you can give to the next generation something better. And maybe even give grace to the generation that preceded you because they were beat up too. Your heart breaks for them. I can tell you some stories from my mom's life. She grew up in the Depression. She's the youngest of 9 kids. Her mother was the scariest person I ever met, my grandmother. And my mother's father died when she was about 17. He was born in 1856. My mother died last year. She was 97. Her father was 9 years old when Lincoln was assassinated. And her family, there was such bitterness and such toxicity in her family. And growing up in the Depression, she had one dress. Every day she'd come home from school, wash the dress, get it out to dry so she could have that dress for the next day. And she grew up in just horrible situations. She wanted to get out of her house because her mother was so bad. She married a guy when she was about 15, 16. And she married him thinking she was going to go from the bad into the good. And this guy used to beat her all the time. Wanted sex with her, but didn't want a baby by her. She becomes pregnant. He beats her up and leaves her life. And so I didn't know she was remarried. And I'm 10 years old, and we're sitting at the dinner table. And my mother always teased that she was younger than she was. And so her anniversary's coming up. I said, what anniversary is it? And she said, it's our 15th. I said, really? If it's your 15th, how come Kathy's 19? What, were you married before? This is a ridiculous possibility, you know, but I'm going to catch her, and she's saying she's younger than she really is. She stood up, wept, burst into tears, and said, yes. Goes into her room. Remember, we have that small house? She's in her room crying. You could hear it everywhere in the house. I look at my dad. He looks down, and nothing that I thought was so was the same, right? Disequilibrium precedes growth. I look at my sister. She's my half-sister. She's my closest sibling to this day. I love her deeply. And I look at her, how is that so? I look at my brothers. I bust my plate, I left. I hated my mother for this. And yet, all I did was compound the grief that she had already endured. It's just sad. So World War II ends. Her husband was long gone. She's a single mom back in that era. My dad comes home. He falls for her. She marries him thinking he'll be her Prince Charming. But remember, his emotional life was on the battlefield someplace, and he couldn't provide for her what she wanted. And she just lived in this state of perpetual anger. But that's unique to our story. You have your own story, and there are dynamics. And some of them are less, and some of them are more, but all of us have some because we're in a broken, fallen world.
I visited with Kim in his office, and I'm going to encourage him to give a message on it. He said something about the dangers of secrets and shadows.
Mm-hmm.
They're not good in our lives.
You know who's helpful? Frederick Buechner. Read his books. He says we are our secrets. The things you can't talk about control you. But you need to be wise. Don't talk about these things to everybody. Talk about these things to safe people who will grieve with you, pray with you, walk with you, and you'll get better. And guess what? Then when they're having problems, you'll be there for them too.
My 3 children.
Huh?
My 3 children, adult children. The eldest is 51, the youngest is 45. A broken relationship, all 3 with one another.
Well,
And the middle daughter, about 10 years ago, took her son and left him in the emergency room in the hospital and said, "You're taking my baby."
oh my word.
He today is she said, call his father. Oh, it was even worse. And to this day, he is so broken, this young man. And he has just completely devoid himself from us and his mother. How do I reach out to him? Every once in a while, his name will come across the iPad. And this morning, I reached out and I wrote him and I said, "Thank you, we love you, we miss you." You know, and about the future
You can't do anything about what you weren't a part of, except be loving towards him and pray for him and so on. Those are significant. But if you can see how the generational sins might have passed through you and own that and go and ask his forgiveness for any part that might have come down that you can do something about, that gives him an opportunity to have his goodwill hunting moment. This wasn't my fault. So he doesn't have to define himself by that anymore. And then you walk with him as he begins to think through who he might have caused collateral damage to. And you walk with him through that. And just love on him. Love on him. But I wish I could say it's easy. I don't know it is. But you've got stories. I mean, when I went through all this counseling stuff, I thought, this is the best thing I've ever done. How come it's not in the Bible? Well, then I saw the Joseph thing right away. And then I started looking at David. David was a great leader and a great man. Why was he such a messed up father? He was a screwed up father. So I go and I want to study his life to find out why he got messed up, his kids and so on. So I go back and I look at where Samuel is told to go anoint one of Jesse's sons as king. So he brings out his first son, Eliab, a big strapping guy, and he looks presidential. You know, we always want to know, what does it look like on the outside? It looks presidential. God says it's not Eliab. So Samuel's told to go anoint one of Jesse's sons. He brings out 6 sons and he stops bringing out any more sons. And Samuel doesn't get it. Where's the other son? And he says to Samuel, Jesse, do you have any other sons? Well, yeah, there's one out here. He doesn't really matter much. And all of a sudden we begin to see how David was marked by not being noticed by his own father. And I don't want to judge Jesse too much. Maybe he was a father who had, 7 sons, had a lot of daughters, had a lot of responsibility. Who knows? He's trying to make ends meet. Could be too, I don't know. Do you have time for one last story? You should go. You should go. Huh? One last story. Okay. So my wife is really good at this stuff. And she always had a thing when our kids got older, especially as we had passed through all this stuff. So Jeremy would have been 17 at the time. So 2 years earlier, I had gone through this stuff with Jeremy. Alicia was 15, and we have 2 others, Grady and Jeff. And Grady is 4 years younger than Alicia, so he's 11, Jeff's 9. And Claudia had this thing, anybody have a beef, family beef? You can call a family meeting, and we'll air it out. It's very good. So Jeff says, I have a beef. I want a family meeting. He's 9 years old. So he says, Claudia makes tea and she makes popcorn. We sit down, we pray. We say, okay, Jeff, what is it? He said, my older brothers and my older sister don't love me. And I just know this isn't true, So I turned to the older ones. I said, we can solve this problem quick. You guys, what do you say? Alicia, the one who's a psychologist, says, we don't. Well, this is a concern. So I said, why do you feel that way? She says, because you and Mom love him more. You and Mom love him more. Well, I know Claudia's heart and I know my heart. We have never played favorites with our kids. Never played favorites with our kids. But if Alicia feels that way, how broken is her heart then? And so I said, Alicia, why do you feel that way? Because it matters. And she said, because we always saw you change his diaper. We always saw you get him dressed. We always saw you feed him. I said, oh, well, we did that with each of you. You just don't remember it. I said, but the interesting thing is, when Jeremy was born, he got all the attention. Matter of fact, firstborns, right? They say they're high-performance treadmill. That's because the parents had never known any other child to do what this child did, so they're performing monkeys. Oh, look what Jeremy does. Oh, look how he can blow a little bubble on his tongue and blow it and make it go out there. Jeremy, do that again for them, right? And we make them be performing monkeys. Gets all the attention, tyrannized by attention. You got a baby book for him? It's thick. It's got everything. First tooth pulled, there's a picture of the toothless smile. First day of school, there's a picture of that. Every refrigerator magnet picture gets in that book. Alicia comes second. I said, Alicia, with you it was cut in half. Secondborns tend to be, there's plenty of exceptions to this, but there's enough to establish a generalization. Secondborns tend to be more competitive because they want to break into the world that's already going and was going before they got there. And Alicia's the first girl, the only girl. So her baby book is also chock full of stuff, right? Thirdborn says, there's too much going on here. I'm never going to be a part of this. And the thirdborns tend to be very independent. There's exceptions. Tend to be very independent. I'm going to find my kudos outside. And it goes like that till you get to the lastborn. The lastborn says, I'm going to give it the old college try. When Claudia and I would be hugging in the kitchen, Jeff would always come over and try and get into that hug. If the other kids had, these lastborns have it tough. If the other kids are coming over with their friends, he would always want to be part of that world. And they'd say, go away, you bother us. You're spoiled. So he hears he's spoiled, but in reality, I said, by the time Jeff came, it's cut in quarters, the attention. Grady, he's got some things in his baby book. Jeff, I know he had a baby book. I think we put his name in it. The other kids lose their first tooth, and they each get a shiny quarter the next morning. I wish you could have been there the day Jeffrey pulled his first tooth, and he thinks he's finally going to get on the money train. And he comes down the next morning with the tooth and crocodile tears. Maybe Jesse was in a moment like that. I say, oh, Jeff, you know what? I think it's tooth harvesting season. Probably the tooth fairy is really busy. I'll bet if you put it under tonight, he'll take care of it. The next morning he comes down and he's still got the tooth. And now my tears match his tears. I know one thing. I don't know what happened to the tooth fairy, but you've got a really bad father. The next morning he comes down, $5! And what do the other kids say? I only got 25 cents. He would have rather have had the 25 cents the morning after. And also, everybody has a narrative that feeds, evidence that feeds their narrative. And then they begin to make judgments about how they feel. And we meant well, but so you start reading this stuff, but it's all in the Bible. Every bit of it. Read all the stories. Why are those narratives put in there? We can learn vicariously through the mistakes of others, so we maybe won't have to go through them ourselves. But there's some we're going to have to go through. And it's going to press us to the love of God, who loves us unconditionally, forgives us utterly, and keeps us looking honestly at our stuff so we could get better and we could pass on more to others. Isn't that cool? It's really cool. Blessings.
I guess he's wrapping up. So let me see if I can snag him.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, just walk
Thank
on up with me.